Good everyone, welcome back to our next edition of Econ Talks. Gareth, we're looking a bit more at the construction sector in recent times, been at some very high levels, no matter what indicator you're looking at, be it construction levels themselves or the cost of building coming forward. The latest numbers, when we looked at inflation a few weeks back, we have seen that again, inflation costs up another, I think, 3.3% when it comes to building a house. That's on top of all the increases we've seen in prior times. I mean, what is coming through in the cost area at the moment? Is it still as bad as it's ever been, or are we seeing some green shoots on the horizon that might mean that we're getting to the end of just how intense those cost pressures have been?
Yeah, there's a little bit of a moderation that's come through in the official data around residential building costs in particular, but it is only a very small moderation. And certainly when I go out and talk to people throughout the industry, they are still experiencing a lot of cost pressures. The sort of sources of those are maybe not quite the same as they were 6 or 12 months ago, whereas it was shipping costs and just supply chain disruptions and shortages of materials. Those are still going on, but maybe not to the same degree. You've still got freight costs, of course, with diesel prices highly elevated. But increasingly, what we're also seeing is just the very tight labour market right across the economy, and that's leading to a significant acceleration in wage pressures. We'd seen that coming anyway, and it has continued to come through. And there is, I guess, a feeling amongst businesses that they are able to pass those costs on, because it is still a case of everyone being very much in the same boat. And indeed, expectations among customers are now that costs will continue to push up. We've seen extended cost pressures over the last 12 or 18 months, and people are kind of a bit used to them now, and so businesses much more comfortable about continuing to pass on any pressures they may be feeling. And of course, if you are in the construction industry looking to build a house or a commercial building, that is not great news in terms of the viability for your project going ahead, particularly given that we're seeing, of course, house prices falling substantially, but also signs of a moderation in commercial and industrial property prices as well, as a result of interest rates starting to rise.
Totally. And I mean, when you think about those cost pressures still continuing to go up at this point, and like you say, that sort of mindset where businesses are pushing through cost increases from their side onto the prices they're charging out. I mean, we saw recently around Gibboard and similar, those prices rising after real supply chain issues and shortages earlier in the year, but also prices effectively being held, at least on the open market, maybe not the black market, but then in more recent times, announcements that look that the cost pressures are there and they still have been maintained, and that's putting the prices up even further. Interesting as well, of course, when we look through some of the various numbers, that those areas that are a little bit more labour intensive, if you will, like you say, with wage pressures going up, with the difficulty still to find workers, unemployment rate remaining near record lows, all continuing to put those costs going higher. The other side, though, that I want to touch on, I mean, you've been traveling the country a bit, so have I, getting out and seeing what's happening. We're seeing in the building consent numbers, maybe those early signs, a bit of a shift coming forward. Certainly not the decline happening that we might have thought might have already been apparent. There looks like there's still a pretty good backlog, right, of activity. But also, like I say, early signs that maybe the turn is coming on, and there's certainly more nervousness around what's to come.
Yeah, look, certainly the evidence in terms of residential activity in particular is that while consents have got up to 51,000 in the last year, we haven't been building anywhere near that rate. And a lot of people I talk to are much more comfortable with a build rate of around about 40,000 as being, sort of sustainable or achievable. So there are real capacity limitations, and, that does line up with the cost pressures that we've seen. You mentioned some signs of a bit of a softening or levelling off in consents, and probably the most astounding part of the numbers has been in terms of townhouses, where they were running up 50% from where they were a year ago, and then the last couple of months they have literally flattened off. The growth rate has pulled back to zero. So that is possibly the first signs of a bit of a turning point. And certainly the messages we're getting back through from the likes of the group home builders and other sort of large scale developers is that they are just not seeing the demand in terms of people walking in the door looking to buy properties now, and they're really starting to pull back in terms of their development development plans. Hasn't come through in the consent numbers, but really that the sort of viability of those projects, the market has turned significantly. And I think heading into 2023, you should be looking at some significant falls coming through in the consent numbers. Activity could hold up for longer because of that backlog of work that we're still waiting to complete. But then there are risks as well that some of those consented projects do end up being cancelled because the market has turned. And so it may well be that that pipeline of work is not quite as robust as the consent numbers might otherwise suggest.
And I think, I mean, you're right. When we look through the numbers, right, you've seen that standalone houses have been falling now for, what, 6, 7, maybe 8 months. But like with townhouses, actually, they've been a lot stronger. And the point you make that effectively they're not falling, they've just leveled off. They've plateaued at that high level. But again, such a quick shift from just growing and growing and growing and never looking like they were about to fall to flattening off in very rapid timeframes. That does suggest, again, there's just that sort of shift or inflection point that looks like it's coming forward. The other bit, we talked a little bit about employment earlier. Of course, the labour market remains tight. There are very high wage pressures going on. But if we are about to see a bit of a turn coming forward, then surely there's a few businesses that are effectively far over capacity in terms of, just how many people they've got on the books. We've seen, of course, in recent times, a few more organisations saying, look, we need to right-size ourselves if the industry is shifting. What's the outlook then for employment across the building sector, but also the likes of real estate and developers and similar who are also part of the ecosystem?
Yeah, it's an interesting dynamic at the moment, of course, with government working to make it easier for businesses to bring in workers from overseas, particularly in the construction sector. They've talked about it. We have yet to see a great deal of evidence that it's impacting on those immigration numbers, but there has been sort of some moves to try and address some of those workforce limitations. But I think we are getting to the phase of the cycle now where activity does start to come into question, and businesses do rightly look at their workforce and go, well, if activity is going to be falling 10 or 20 or maybe 30% over the next couple of years, then I don't necessarily need the same number of people that I've had. And indeed, I've had to pay people very handsomely to attract and retain them over the last 18 months or so, given how tight those pressures have been. And so I think we are moving into a situation where you will see some firms that have, expanded significantly start to move into a phase where they reduce their worker numbers. And that won't be an actively laying off people necessarily. It will be a bit of natural attrition in there. And maybe you do get to a phase where they go, okay, if you want to go and look for alternative employment, or you don't enjoy working here, well, that's fine. We're happy to sort of give you a bit of redundancy and off you go, just to start scaling ourselves down. At the same time, we are seeing reports of increased liquidations and businesses running into difficulty, particularly in the construction sector. And I think we're probably only at the edge of that, really, and there could be quite a bit more to come through next year. And the reality is, for some of those workers as well, it will be difficult as activity falls away if people do go out of business, for them to then go and find a new job as well. So we are moving into a phase where I think construction employment will come under significant pressure, and probably a little bit more so than the rest of the economy overall, because it does tend to be quite a boom-bust industry. It's had massive growth over the last 11 years, far outstripping the sort of economic growth we've seen during that time, and so also probably is exposed to a significant downturn over the next couple of years as conditions start to contract.
Quite a big shift then in the construction market. Like you say, we've got those higher costs that continue to push through. You've got a bit of a change in what's happening in building activity itself. Still high for the moment and a good pipeline, but also very early signs, if you will, of a change coming around. And then the workforce as well, compounding that expectation that things are shifting, but also a nervous position where people have struggled to find staff for such a long time. They're going to be reluctant to immediately cast people out on the footpath, given those difficulties. We'll continue to assess how the construction market evolves, where those costs go, and again, how employment might shape out on one of our future editions of Econ Talks.